Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Adam Sutton and I'm the lead pottery specialist on the A14 Cambridge to Huntingdon Road Improvement Scheme. So I'm going to be talking today about one of the most significant finds that we've had from the scheme, which is evidence for early Roman industry in the form of several pottery production sites. Industrial sites like these are not the most glamorous of sites, so they don't sort of get the same attention as, say, prehistoric monuments or really fancy burials. But hopefully today I'm going to show you that these humble sites and the finds that they produce are no less important for allowing us to recover the stories of people who lived long ago. So before we get into the archaeology, I want to ask what may or may not be an easy question to answer. Why should any of us be interested in how pottery was made at all? Now, in my mind, the answer to this is because by studying the archaeological evidence of craft working, we are actually studying the evidence for people's working lives in the past. As we all know nowadays, how we work can be a major part of our lives, a fundamental part of how we survive and thrive, and a big part of our personal identities. And the same will have been true at distant points in the past as well. So take these two images. On the left, we have a potter sat at their wheel, throwing a pot. This picture was taken in the late 1970s, but scenes like this will have played out across the world for the last several millennia, with subtle differences. Were this scene to have taken place in the distant past, most of what we see here would not have survived until today. The wooden bench would have perished, and the building in which the potter was working would have fallen into ruin. The potter himself would be long gone, so that we can no longer ask him about his life or his work. Even his tools are likely to have been scattered or recycled, and so we don't really have that much to go on when we're recovering this stuff archaeologically. But what remains is therefore precious for allowing us to reconstruct elements of the skill and artistry of past craftspeople and how they made their livings, learned their crafts, and experienced life in the alien circumstances of history. On the right, meanwhile, we have an X-ray of the base of a broken pot derived from an archaeological assemblage. So this is the sort of trace of past craftworking which does actually survive. Pottery is a really durable artifact type, and it's often found in abundance on ancient production sites, and is frequently the main source of evidence for the industry which was being undertaken there. By looking at finds like this in the right way, in this case using X-rays, we can find evidence for our potter's work. These thin, dark areas, for instance, spiral out from the base of the pot and are evidence of the fast wheel throwing which was used to make this vessel. These are traces which only show up in the X-ray. And so it really is testament to the fact that we need to look at these things in the right sort of ways and think about them in the right sort of ways in order to get what we're interested in. But it's really interesting because the point at which this pot was made, the skill of throwing on the wheel was actually only a few generations old amongst the communities who used this. So we're really getting to grips with the kind of practice of being a craftsperson in the distant past through this evidence. Our excavations on the A14 have revealed a huge amount of this precious evidence, which allows us to build up an extremely detailed picture of what working life will have been like for craftspeople thousands of years ago. So today I'm going to show you some of what we found. I'm going to start by describing and characterizing the archaeological evidence for what we've termed the Low Roos Valley pottery industry, which is a completely new industry which has come to us through light of the A14 excavations. I'm going to talk about the layouts of the potteries, a really crucial source of evidence, and also the techniques and the technologies and what the finds can tell us about the working conditions that people lived in this point in the distant past. I'm going to discuss this through the form of three key themes. I'm going to talk about how was Low Roos Valley pottery made, how did potters organize themselves and on what scales, and how do people make a living out of making pottery. But all of that's going to be anchored to this core question, which is, what does all of this tell us about people's working lives in the distant past? Keeping this centered on the people that are the crux of our story. So here is a map of the western part of the A14 road improvement scheme as the scheme kind of curves around the modern village of Brampton. This is the area where we found some of the best evidence for Romano-British industry in decades. The A14 was host to 39 Roman pottery kilns, which were excavated, of which 33 were dated to the early Roman period and are situated in this part of the landscape. They are indicated here by these red circles, and you can see that they kind of cluster in little groups. These corresponding to what we might distinguish as individual pottery sites. So kind of like a small scale version of a factory. Additionally to this, 8 very similar kilns making identical pottery to those made in the A14 kilns were excavated at RAF Brampton by our colleagues Oxford Archaeology East in 2016. And together we have named this cluster of sites the Lower Ouse Valley Industry. Now you can see that it's clustered around this kind of quite small area of the landscape in the lower part of the Great Ouse Valley as it flows past Godmanchester. But it's really quite a broad area when you're thinking archaeologically. A lot of the time when we find an industrial site, you're talking about the site level. So the A14 has really given us a chance to synthesize on a really wide scale, a big amount of evidence for the way these industrial processes worked on a landscape scale. And that's really crucial to the way that we've studied these sites and been able to compare one of them with another, for instance. In total, we think we've got evidence for 8 distinct potteries within this landscape. And it's important to note that the Roman town of Godmanchester, which is just a few kilometers away, was beginning to develop around the time that this industry was getting going. So that's probably some interesting context which you want to make note of here. So I'm going to be talking quite a lot about Roman pottery kilns. So I'll begin by describing what I actually mean by that and talking about how these things worked. So this is an example of a pottery kiln which is of a very similar type to that which we excavated numerous of on the A14. The kilns of this type are typically consistent of 2 pits dug into the ground, probably up to about maybe half a meter in depth. You've got one pit which is generally quite well insulated, lined with clay, and that's what we call the firing chamber. And then the pit next to it will normally be unlined and will be a bit more amorphous in shape, and that's the stoking area. So that's where the potter will have stood when they were actually working the kiln. Between the 2 pits, you've got a narrow channel, often covered with an arch, and that's called the firebox, the flue. And this is where the potter will have maintained a fire in order to get the temperature of the kiln up to what he wanted it to be, what they wanted it to be. Internally, the kiln would have been provided with a temporary floor, which will have served to elevate the pottery above the level of the base of the pit, in order that the airflow can get at the pots in the way that it needs to in order to fire them to the right temperature. Normally, the elevated internal floor will kind of be roughly on ground level. So imagine that everything else below that is sort of subterranean. And then above that, you'll have a superstructure, or what we often call the dome, which is then built over the top of the pottery load once it's been stacked on top of the elevated internal floor. The superstructure was normally largely removable so that you could actually retrieve the pots once you've put them in there. The superstructure often also has a vent or two, which allows the circulation of gases through the kiln and out safely away. As I say, in the firebox, you start off by lighting a fire, and this starts to raise the temperature within the kiln. Air currents coming through the firebox actually radiate into the firing chamber, serving to heat the firing chamber up to between about 800 and 1000 degrees C, and that provides the temperatures necessary to get the pots fired to their nice, lovely hardness that you need them to in order to make them so durable that they now survive thousands of years. So overall, it's a fairly simple principle, but actually these kilns are really quite complex structures, and they evidence quite a detailed understanding of pyrotechnology. And when we find them archaeologically, generally speaking, we only find those subterranean parts of it. The superstructure only relatively rarely survives. So what we get are the firing chambers and the stoke holes, and sometimes with the flue and the flue arch intact. These are some of the examples from the Lower Ouse Valley kilns, and you can see on the interior of the firing chambers, you've got in situ arrangement of props and pedestals, on top of which that temporary flooring will have been built and the pots stacked. You can see some of them have the scorch marks that are evidence of the high temperatures to which the kilns were fired. And as well as that, you've got in situ clay linings and things like that as well. The flue arches survive on some of these as well. So that's what they look like when we find them. As I say, we've got an awful lot of these from the A14, and they're a really, really crucial source of evidence, and I'll go on to discuss them a bit more detail shortly. The pottery that was being made itself, again, we've got this in abundance. There is around about 100 kilos of waste pottery that's come out of the Lower East Valley kilns that we've excavated to date. And that's an enormous resource. It means that we can characterize the products that were being made by potters in way back in the Roman period. And it also provides a really, really useful resource that we can analyze scientifically. And by doing that, we can find out how this pottery was made. The types, I won't go into too much detail about this because very few people actually are that interested in all of the details of pottery types, and I kind of get that. But basically, just to say that it falls into three main types, and that these are the most common, generally speaking, types of pots that you get on consumption sites in the immediate area in the early Roman period. So based on the evidence of that, we think that the dates for these pots are around about AD 60 or 70 to about AD 130 or 150. We could potentially stretch that latter date a little bit, but we're trying to keep it as tight as we can. So essentially, these are the sorts of things which you would have made should you want to produce pots that are going to be widely used by the local communities. We don't know particularly how they were traded, but if you wanted to make stuff, people that you didn't necessarily know, and you wanted to be confident that they were going to want to use this stuff, these are the sorts of things that you wanted to make because you knew that these are the sorts of pots that they were using anyway, because we've got lots of them from other sites in other wares. So the first part of the talk, I'm going to talk about how we've analysed the ceramics and the kilns in various ways in order to work out how Lower East Valley pottery was actually made, in order to get an impression of the complexity of the technology that people had access to and how specifically they employed that technology in order to create the outcomes that they wanted. The first sort of analysis that I want to talk about is what we call thin section analysis. This is where you take a thin slide, like a microscope slide of ceramic, and grind it down really thin so that you can actually see through it. It kind of becomes more or less translucent. So looking at it with a certain type of microscope, you can identify the minerals in there, and thereby look at the sort of compositions that the clays had, and thereby you can pick apart, where the clays were from and the sorts of additives that were put into the clays in order to manipulate their properties. The most striking thing that we've come across with regards to the Lower East Valley ceramics is that it seems like they were actually really, really elaborately processed. We've got evidence for example, on the left, there are these streaks that appear in a lot of the ceramics, and these kind of little grains, these little pellets. Now, these are dehydrated clay pellets, and that implies that at some point the clay has been dehydrated and only partially rehydrated in some cases. That signifies that clays have been mixed and that those clays have actually been processed to a really, really high degree into a fine quality in order to remove any impurities, and then to mix clays together in order to manipulate the qualities of those clays in order to create something which had the properties which you wanted for creating pots of certain types. This doesn't seem to be to do particularly with function, because all of the clays used to make Lower East Valley pots seem to have been more or less uniform. But what it probably has to do with is the fact that they wanted to throw this stuff on a wheel, and so you needed a clay that was particularly sort of malleable, so that it would be it would have the necessary properties to hold its own weight as it was thrown on the wheel. We've got ethnographic evidence for these sorts of processes, but it's worth noting that prehistoric pottery, which was probably only a few generations, made up to a few generations before the Lower East Valley industry kicked off, was going through relatively minimal processing. Sometimes they would add inclusions in order to create clays with different properties, but by and large, the clays were very coarse and would have been more or less dug from the ground and used as found. The fact that this wasn't the case with the Lower East Valley industry suggests that they had elevated their craft slightly, so that they were manipulating the properties and the materials and really getting to grips with the differences between different raw materials and then combining those in innovative ways. The second form of analysis which we did was to analyze how the pots were actually formed into shape. Now, this is kind of the bit that you always tend to think of when you think about making pottery. It's kind of creating a ball of clay into something which has a recognizable shape. The Lower East Valley potters actually had multiple methods of doing this, among which the most common was wheel throwing. This is signified, as I alluded to in the introduction, by the telltale signs found in X-rays, whereby you get these spiraling or diagonal alignments of inclusions and internal features, which are visible only in X-ray. They're not actually visible on surfaces of the ceramics themselves. And that's a dead giveaway for wheel throwing. And this trace was identified in the vast majority of Lower East Valley ceramics, which we analysed, which suggests that the vast majority of this stuff was actually being wheel thrown. That is also interesting because, again, a generation or two before this industry kicked off, that wasn't the case. Hand building by various different methods was more or less the norm up until sort of the middle of the 1st century AD. And it's only really at this point that wheel throwing takes on the predominant role. So again, we're looking at an innovative culture of craftsmanship here. But that's not to say that that's universally the case. Hand building techniques actually continued on, and this is also evident in the format of the manufacture of some of the Lower East Valley ceramics. So, for instance, in these X-rays, we've got images of partially unsmoothed coil joins, which evidence the fact that these are pots built up by straps or coils of clay which have been stacked on top of one another in order to create the rough shape of the pot that you wanted to make. In the lower part of that X-ray labeled A, you've also got actual finger impressions, which are the result of the potter using their fingers to manually smooth together the coils in order to obliterate any sign of them and thereby make the pot watertight. This technique is called wheel coiling because actually once you've built up the rough shape of the pot, you would then put it on a wheel and turn it in order to even out any inconsistencies in the ways that, that maybe it is a little bit wonky and you wanted to just kind of right that. The Lower East Valley potters were evidently very skilled at this because when we do find evidence for wheel coiling, it's only really in the X-rays. You can't actually tell just by looking at the vessels themselves. So they're clearly very good at hiding the fact that sometimes these things were initially a little bit wonky. And another thing which is really interesting with the ways that the pottery seems to have been made is that the colors of the ceramics are very, very consistent. This is, again, not a trait that is associated with prehistoric pottery. And in the generations prior to the establishment of this industry, in the middle of the 1st century AD, it was very much normal for pots to look a bit mottled in their color. Sometimes you get a bit of brown, a bit of orange, a bit of black, a bit of gray, and it's not particularly consistent. That all changes with the introduction of the sort of kiln technology which comes in with the Lower East Valley industry. Here we've got a consistent grey product, what we call a Roman greyware, which is a very, very common type of Roman ceramic. But here we've really got the beginnings of this tradition, the first generations of craftspeople who are making this stuff. Crucially, we've got actual technological evidence for how this was done in the Lower East Valley. So in the example of this kiln here, with a picture having been taken immediately before this kiln was excavated, so you can sort of see the red-brown outline of the firing chamber and the dark fill of the stokehole there. Between the two, where the flue is, has been plugged with a large stone. This is a slightly unusual trait, though not completely unheard of in Roman Britain. And we think that it's part of the way in which that grey colour would have been achieved. So, for instance, when you have begun firing a kiln, if you plug the vents, including the flue, it means that the airflow to the interior atmosphere is disrupted. That means that any hot gases that you've got on the inside continue to just flow without the absence of any additional oxygen. This is what we call a reduction condition. And it means that the absence of that oxygen deprives the clays of the necessary oxidation that they require in order to create red and white colors. Instead, you're more likely to get consistent grays and blacks. And that's how this would have been achieved. So we think that this stone, innocuous as it may look and just kind of happenstance, probably is part of the technological process that they actually used to create this distinctive type of ceramic, which would have been a novelty at the time. So the second part of the talk, I'm going to talk about how pottery production was actually organized and on what sorts of scales. We've got some really good evidence for this from the A14, including but not limited to the fact that we've got some more or less complete and very, very large scale, owing to the landscape scale of the project, plans of the production sites themselves. Now, the plan on the screen at the moment is of what we call the TA11 Eastern Group pottery site. And this seems to be more or less a part of the landscape which was completely turned over for pottery production for a relatively small period of time. There's no real pre-existing occupation in this area, and what comes afterwards seems to be fairly ephemeral, probably just an adjunct to kind of surrounding agricultural life. In this area, there were at least 5 or possibly 6 pottery kilns established. And they're kind of dotted around this part of the landscape in a relatively haphazard way. There's no real impression of internal organization here, and that's interesting for reasons that I'll come on to in a second. Additionally to the kilns, you've got a trackway running roughly east to west across the site in the northern part, and that probably served to bring raw materials in to the site and also to ship completed pots out of the site. So very useful and very common to find these things in association with pottery production sites for reasons that are pretty obvious. And in the middle of the site, you've got a roughly square enclosure with what looks like a probable structure in the middle of it. And this structure may actually represent the workshop where the pottery was actually made. The structure looks like it's probably fairly ephemeral. It's just a line of post holes. So you're probably talking about something as ephemeral as a lean-to, a windbreak even, but just somewhere for the potters to work. As well as that, in the southern part of the site, you've got a number of post-built structures, which I've highlighted in red there. These are interesting ones because they're sorts of structures that don't normally come across on pottery making sites, but you do come across them on Iron Age and Roman rural settlements, as they seem to be what we call 4-post granaries or grain dryers. And these structures are theorized to have been sort of elevated platforms on which you would build a small structure in which you could store grain above the generally quite wet, particularly in southern Britain, ground level. That stops things like pests getting in. It stops things rotting and going all nasty. So that's an interesting one, and the fact that they're here on what ostensibly looks like a pottery production site is really intriguing. And I think probably what's going on here is that you've got similar sorts of structures which are being erected for the purpose of drying pots. Once you've made pottery, you then need to leave it to one side for a few days, maybe a few weeks if it's a bit of a damper part of the year, to really dry out and make sure that any water that is lurking in that wet clay kind of more or less evaporates, so that when you put it in a kiln and it gets fired really to really high temperatures, the pots don't just shatter with the weight of all that steam. These structures here, we've got at least 4 of them, probably therefore formed quite an important part of the sequence by which pottery was made. And I think it's really interesting actually that we've got these in association with these kilns, because you don't often see them here. And it kind of, again, lends weight to the impression that this is a more or less complete pottery production site that we've excavated on the A14. The TA11 Southern Group, and this is just a few hundred meters south of the site that I've just spoken about, provides a quite different picture, actually. You can see, based on the plan here, really all you've got are 7 kilns arranged in 3 groups, 2 groups of 2 kilns each, and another group of 3. Now, There aren't really any ancillary structures. There's none of those dryers. There's no obvious workshop structure. And it sort of looks like the kilns were actually on the edge of a roughly contemporary settlement. So you've got a wider enclosure system just a small distance away, most of which seems to be a little bit later in date, but which starts to have developed around the time that these kilns will have been in operation. So potentially you've got the kind of nucleus of this settlement developing at the same time that these kilns were working. And potentially, therefore, we can think about, well, were these kilns actually supplying the people who were living in this developing settlement? It's also interesting because the regularity of the layout of these kilns is kind of distinctive. And it looks like the kind of linear layout and the kind of right angle that they seem to align to may represent a lost boundary feature. And potentially that means that actually these kilns were on the very edge of this settlement, or at least we were respecting some kind of feature which lay within the wider landscape. So again, you've got a slightly different setup, slightly different organization to what we got in the TA11 Eastern group, which I've just spoken about, with a far more direct link to contemporary settlement in the case of these kilns. But nowhere near as direct an association as you've got on TAs 14 and 15. Here you've actually got isolated kilns, so they're not grouped at all, and therefore they seem to probably represent a bit more of a smaller scale industry. So for instance, on TA 15, which is the plan on the right of the current image, you've got a single kiln found within a contemporary enclosure system, adjacent to another structure. So this kind of looks to me like a working area, maybe a yard or something similar, which has been maybe turned over to pottery production, or maybe it's something that was used predominantly for something else and just found a use in pottery production at certain times of the year. But its close association with this wider enclosure system and with structural evidence suggests that the industry here was much better integrated into the wider settlement pattern. There's no story here about turning land over to pottery production wholesale. It seems like you've probably got small scale industry operating within the context of essentially contemporary farming. We've got at least 3 examples of kilns like this, and so that seems to suggest that this is not a unique scenario, but more or less that you've got different modes of production within this wider industry, and that's quite interesting. It sort of asks questions of what the how this craft was integrated into the wider regional economy, and I'll come on to that in a second to talk about it in a bit more detail. But a really crucial question within all of this is what sort of scale and what sort of intensity are we talking about? At the beginning of this talk, I threw around a lot of fairly large numbers. You know, we're talking 39 kilns, 33 of them are associated with one another, etc. That's actually a staggeringly large number of kilns to have found on any one excavation program. And there are very few excavations in Roman Britain that can boast bigger numbers. But is this to lead us to the conclusion that actually we've got a really intensive industry here? I don't think so. I think that probably what we've got going on is a much more small scale industry, but that stretched out over time, so that you've got kilns and workshops which were potentially working sequentially or maybe year on year. Evidence for this comes in the form of 2 intercutting kilns at RAF Brampton, where you've got actually one kiln which has been obviously demolished and then cut into by a later kiln. So that evidences the fact that not all of these structures were in use at the same time. And that's important because it allows us to then think, well, okay, maybe we're not dealing with a big factory scenario, people churning products out year in, year out. You're probably talking about occasional production and the kind of movement around the landscape rather than big intensive instances of industry. And this is also borne out when we look at the sizes of the kilns. The Lower East Valley kilns tend to be really small relative to contemporary kilns of the Roman period. You can see in blue on this chart, the Lower East Valley kilns are consistently smaller than the kilns associated with other industries in the nearby area. And this also suggests that the industry would have been probably of modest intensity. Again, you're not talking about big loads of stuff and people trying to be really efficient with the way that they're producing pottery. You're talking about people doing this probably on the side. And this is also borne out in the nature of the technology as well. Remember wheel coiling? This is a traditional technique, which is it actually takes quite a long time to get really good at wheel coiling, kind of like wheel throwing. If anybody's ever had a go at pottery, you can probably empathize with how difficult it is to get the grip of using the potter's wheel. It's really tricky when you're first getting going. So it takes a long time to build up those skills and get good at it, particularly if you're trying to make stuff for other people rather than just ornaments for yourself. Then, so wheel coiling is something which takes a long time, but actually doesn't improve the efficiency of production that much at all. And the implication of that is that you've, again, got this impression of people who are making things for specific purposes and not necessarily just because they're churning stuff out, trying to make as much money as they can. They're probably doing this on the side and just as a little bit of extra income, supplementary to whatever else it was they were doing year on year. And this is an argument which has been made numerous times and which has been the subject of intense argument between specialists. So who were these craftspeople? Were they actually specialists? Were they actual professional potters, or were they people who were just doing stuff kind of casually and as a means to generate a little bit of extra income for themselves? These humble clay plates, believe it or not, even being these kind of really unpretentious little objects, are actually a bit of a missing link in this story. So these are really thin kind of cowpat-like clay plates, which have just been kind of smushed into a roughly flat shape and then used in some way in the operation of the kilns. We're not sure precisely how, but it seems likely that either they're part of the insulation used in the dome capping, or that they're part of the elevated flooring materials. We're not quite sure. We haven't found any in situ, so we can't quite tell. However, the important thing to note about these is that if you look really closely at this image, you can see that there's lots of little grass and chaff impressions on the surface. Now that's where whoever's made these things has pressed the clay down onto a bed of loose material so that it doesn't stick to whatever surface they're working on. That's just made things a bit easier for them. But what's actually interesting is that when I gave some examples of these clay plates to one of our archaeobotanists for analysis, she looked at these and concluded that the impressions were consistent with waste agricultural products. So things like chaff and weeds and stuff that you get rid of when you're processing cereals and things like that. So we've got evidence for a connection with agriculture, and that's actually quite important. So I think probably what we're looking at here is the missing link that we've got a hint towards in that integration of some of these kilns into the agricultural landscape, in that potters seem to have been very, very closely linked with farmers. In fact, there is probably a strong argument to say that the potters were actually the farmers as well, and that the pottery was actually just a sideline for them to make a little bit of extra income on during the off season, potentially probably in the summer months when conditions are at their best, at their warmest for making pottery and allowing them to dry out and giving you the hopefully inclement conditions by which you can be outside for long periods of time without getting rained on. And so this is a really interesting link between those two groups of people, and potentially hinting that they're actually not two groups of people at all, that these are just integrated aspects of the local economies of this period. So a final section, how do people make a living out of making pottery? Well, actually, it's a bit of a trick question, because based on what I've just said, they kind of didn't. Pottery would have been made on the side and was just a bit of a supplementary to the ways that people would have predominantly made their living through farming. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not necessarily interesting to map out things like the distribution of the ceramics, because this can tell us quite a lot about the degrees of interconnectivity between communities, and also the methods by which things were exchanged, and the nature of the economy in this period as it kind of emerges from the prehistoric Iron Age background into what we know as the Romano-British economy. Now, it's been quite difficult to define the distribution of low risk value pottery for reasons that are fairly straightforward. We only defined this ware in summer 2020, so only about 3 years ago. So we've not had that much time to trace the distribution of the wares by identifying it on other sites nearby. That said, we do have some examples where we can be fairly confident that we've identified examples of low risk value pottery away from the kiln sites. These include two A14 sites, that TA5, which is just to the north of the main industrial area, and that at TA38, which is over near Bar Hill, way out of the industrial area. These are our only confirmed identifications of the ceramic away from production sites, but they're nevertheless interesting in beginning to give us an impression of how far this stuff moved. Now, in both cases, TA5 and TA38, we are talking very small amounts of pottery, but nevertheless, its presence in these areas suggests that actually the distribution may have been fairly substantial and may have covered a lot of southern Cambridgeshire, but we won't know the full details until much more work is done. We also think we might have identified some at Little Paxton Quarry, just to the south, and also at Godmanchester, just to the east. The link with Godmanchester is particularly important, and I think probably revisiting some of the archives over at that part of the world would be quite beneficial in order to see whether any of that stuff is reaching there and whether it was being attracted there as a potential marketplace or not, as the case may be. It's also interesting to look at those types which are a little bit rarer amongst the things that the potters were making. Now, I said earlier that the stuff that they were making tended to be the kind of widely consumed pot types that people generally wanted, and that potters could probably be quite confident that people were going to buy. This isn't the case among all of them, and in some cases we've got actual rarities or indeed oddities, things which seem to be the result of the potters innovating kind of on the fly. An example of this are these bowls, what we call these wide carinated bowls. Now, they're quite shallow vessels, and so they're probably for a particular purpose, and they've got these really distinctive rim shapes. They were common in one of the kilns, which is in the TA11 Southern Enclosure group, the one with the kind of line of kilns which I spoke about earlier. But they're really rare elsewhere. So there's not really any reason to believe that they were being made on a widespread basis. Perhaps they were just an experimentation of one or a small group of potters. They're basically an open version of the basic lid-seated jar type, which was the most common overall type that was made by the potters here. And I think there's probably a strong argument to say that someone must have come along and said to the potters, well, I could really do with something for this specific purpose. Is there any way you can help me out? And so the potters maybe said, well, you know, I make this sort of thing normally. I can tweak that sort of recipe for you very subtly and create something which is just slightly different, but which will help afford your needs in this case. So potentially we're looking at a small batch, potentially an individual commission, and that we've actually got physical evidence for this, which has come out of the archaeology. I think that's really interesting because quite often we talk about types and the ways that types change through time, but it's only really by looking at these production assemblages in quite a lot of detail and identifying these instances of innovation that you can actually see the emergence of new types of artifact from one to another. And I think just archaeologically, that's a fascinating observation to make. And another example of this is what we have so-called cheese presses. I say so-called because recent analysis suggests that they weren't actually made for making cheese at all, but we don't know what they're for. There's some kind of sieve, potential processing vessel. Now, there were several found at RAF Brampton. That's the site that Oxford Archaeology East dug back in 2016. But we actually only had one from the A14 assemblages overall. And this again suggests that you've got a particular product associated with a particular kiln site, but which wasn't being made elsewhere. So potentially another example of marketing via direct commission and direct relationships between consumers and producers, and also potentially argument for part specialization, in that potters may be specialized in making specific parts of the repertoire and not all of it. So again, an interesting little link to the way that potters probably worked with their consumers. So just to wrap this up now, we've got some really interesting conclusions here about what life must have been like for potters, craftspeople in general in first century Cambridgeshire. And I think that the archaeological evidence that we've come to from the A14 has been really, really instrumental in giving us a massive leap forward in the way that we understand this stuff. Some conclusions that we can take away: that the layouts of the Lower Valley potteries suggest that pottery making was not conducted in line with a single organisational template, that it was probably a skill which was acquired by various people for various needs, but predominantly tied to the agricultural cycle. It seems likely that any of the potteries saw more than one or two kilns in use at any one time, and this suggests that the production of Lower Valley pottery was actually probably quite limited in scale. It wasn't a factory, it was more of a cottage industry, small scale, and that's probably the way that we need to think about a lot of Romano-British industries going forward. Therefore, despite the impression of scale that we've got on the basis that we've excavated a lot of this evidence, this wasn't production on an industrial scale. And instead, it seems that potters produced small amounts of pottery at a time, potentially enough to supply their own households, with a limited surplus that could be used as exchange, or actually could be used to package other items that were actually the medium that was of value in the exchange. Potters appear likely to have been part-time craftspeople, conducting crafts during the warmer months and probably farming much of the rest of the time. The reason why they took this craft on as a part-time thing, we can only really hypothesize that, but potentially taxation pressures introduced with the imposition of Roman government are maybe a factor, or potentially the fact that they saw the opportunity that being integrated into a different sort of economy provided, and decided to make the most of that opportunity by making stuff for exchange during the off season. So thank you.